A woman from the Bronx vanished in the spring of 1979 on her way home from the night shift. Her co-workers saw her leave. Her husband heard the front door of the apartment building open one floor below him and assumed it was her coming up the stairs. It was not. She was gone before he reached the landing, but 45 years later, a detective working from a storage unit full of evidence that no one had looked at in 3 decades matched a single fingerprint to a man who had lived 4 floors above the woman he killed. A man who had attended her funeral, signed the condolence card for her family, and continued living in that building for 11 more years before anyone thought to look up. The South Bronx in the spring of 1979 was not the neighborhood it had been a decade earlier, and it was not yet the neighborhood it would eventually become. It was something in between, emptied out, burned over, the landscape of a city that had spent 4 years in fiscal collapse and was only beginning to consider the possibility of recovery. Whole blocks had been abandoned, the buildings stripped for copper and left open to weather and whoever needed a place to disappear. The city had laid off thousands of police officers and firefighters in the budget crisis of 1975, and the precincts that covered the South Bronx were running on personnel levels that made a thorough investigation of anything feel like a luxury. And yet people lived there. Families had lived in the same apartment buildings for 2 and 3 generations, the kind of urban permanence that the decay around them had not yet fully dislodged. They knew their neighbors the way people in small towns know their neighbors, by the sound of their footsteps in the hallway, by the smell of what they cooked on Sunday evenings, by the particular way a door closed at the end of a shift. The building at 1114 Morrow Avenue was one of those buildings. 6 floors, 32 units. A super named Mr. Bautista, who had been there since 1961 and who knew every family by name. Elena Rosa Vega had lived on the 3rd floor of 1114 Morrow Avenue since 1971, when she had moved from Puerto Rico with her husband, Thomas, who worked maintenance for the Transit Authority. Elena was 34 years old in 1979. She had 2 sons, Miguel, who was 11, and Carlos, who was 8. She had been working the overnight shift at Bronx Lebanon Hospital for 4 years in the housekeeping department, a job she had taken specifically because the overnight differential pay was better, and because it let her be home when the boys left for school in the morning and when they came home in the afternoon. She slept from 10 to 3, got up, made their snacks, did her housework, cooked dinner, saw Thomas and the boys through their evening, and left for the hospital at 10:30 at night. She had done this 5 nights a week for 4 years without complaint, because the mathematics of it worked, and because Elena Vega was the kind of woman who made the mathematics work, regardless of what it cost her. She was a woman her neighbors on Morrow Avenue described with a consistency that spoke to how genuinely known she was, dependable, warm, unshowy about her kindness. The first person on the floor to bring food when someone was sick, and the last person to ask for anything in return. She kept an immaculate apartment with a small garden on the fire escape, tomatoes and basil and 1 stubborn pepper plant that produced every summer against all reasonable expectation. She called her mother in Ponce every Sunday morning at 9 o'clock without exception. She had been learning English when she arrived, and was now more comfortable in it than she sometimes admitted, using the gap between what people thought she understood and what she actually understood as a way of learning more about the people around her than they intended to reveal. Her younger son Carlos would later describe this quality with a kind of retrospective admiration. She always knew more than she let on, about everything. On the night of April 3, 1979, Elena Vega clocked out of Bronx Lebanon Hospital at 6:45 in the morning. Her co-worker, a woman named Dolores Ruiz, walked with her as far as the bus stop on Grand Concourse and watched her board the northbound bus at 6:52. The ride to the stop nearest Morrow Avenue was 12 minutes. From that stop, the building was a 4-minute walk. At 7:15, Thomas Vega heard the front door of the building open from inside the apartment. He was already awake, getting the boys ready for school. He assumed it was Elena. He called down the hallway toward the door. There was no answer. He assumed she had gone straight to the bathroom. He went back to making breakfast. By 7:45, when Elena had not appeared and the boys were about to leave, he knocked on the bathroom door. It was empty. He checked the bedroom. He checked the kitchen. He went to the front door of the apartment and opened it and looked down the hallway in both directions. It was empty. He called Dolores Ruiz. She told him Elena had gotten on the bus. Thomas Vega took his sons to the elevator, put them on the street, watched them walk toward school, and then began to search. Elena Vega was found at 7 minutes past noon on April 3, 1979, in the utility stairwell between the ground floor and the basement of 1114 Morrow Avenue. She was found by Mr. Bautista, who had gone to check the boiler. She had been there since close to 7 in the morning. The cause of death was determined to be ligature strangulation. She was 34 years old. The investigation was assigned to the 41st Precinct, a precinct that in 1979 was operating with roughly 60% of its pre-crisis staffing level and processing a caseload that its remaining detectives described, in later interviews, as genuinely unmanageable. The detective who caught the Vega case was a man named Raymond Soto, who was carrying 11 active investigations at the time of the assignment. He would later say that he had done everything he could with what he had, and that what he had was not enough. He said this without defensiveness, because by the time he said it, he was 70 years old and had spent 30 years being honest about the things that had gone wrong. Investigators canvassed all 32 units at 1114 Morrow Avenue over the course of 4 days. 18 units opened their doors. 14 did not. Residents who were at work, who did not answer, who had reasons of their own for not engaging with the police in 1979 in the South Bronx, that had nothing to do with the case and everything to do with the neighborhood's relationship with the department at that particular moment in history. Of the 18 interviews conducted, several produced relevant information. A woman on the 5th floor had heard footsteps on the utility stairwell at approximately 7 in the morning, heavier than she would have expected, moving quickly. A man on the 2nd floor had heard what he described as a brief, muffled sound from the direction of the stairwell, also around 7, which he had attributed to the building's old plumbing. One resident who did not answer when investigators knocked was a 42-year-old man named Gerard Poole, who lived in Unit 6C on the 6th floor. Poole worked as a night watchman for a warehousing company in Hunts Point. He had, according to building records, lived at 1114 Morrow Avenue since 1973. Mr. Bautista described him as quiet, prompt with his rent, not social. He had no interactions with other tenants that anyone could recall. When investigators returned the following day, Poole answered the door. He said he had been home all morning on April 3rd, sleeping after his overnight shift. He said he had not heard anything. He said he was sorry about Mrs. Vega. She had seemed like a nice woman. He said he hoped they found who did it. A fingerprint was lifted from the interior railing of the utility stairwell near the point where Elena had been found. It was partial, 3 distinct ridge segments, and in 1979 the technology for matching partial prints to individuals required a human examiner and a comparison file. The print was logged as evidence. It was not matched to anyone in the investigation. A second print, fuller, was lifted from the door handle at the entrance to the stairwell from the ground floor lobby. It was also logged. It was also not matched. By the late summer of 1979, the active investigation had produced no arrest and no named suspect. Detective Soto noted in the case file that several interviews had not been completed and that the canvas of the building had not been fully closed. He requested additional support from his supervisor. The request was denied on resource grounds. He noted the denial in the file. The file was transferred to a cold case designation in 1981. It was moved to long-term evidence storage in 1986. Elena Vega's family did not leave Morrow Avenue immediately. Thomas kept the apartment for 2 more years because the boys were in school and because leaving felt like abandoning the place where Elena had lived. By 1981, he had moved the family to his sister's house in Queens. Miguel and Carlos grew up, moved on, built lives. Thomas remarried in 1988 and moved to New Jersey. He died in 2011. Carlos, the younger son, was 40 years old when his father died. He had spent his adult life carrying the particular weight that children carry when a parent is murdered and no one is ever charged. Not the clean grief of loss, but the grinding, unresolved grief of injustice without an ending. Every October, Carlos Vega submitted a written inquiry to the New York City Police Department's Cold Case Unit, asking for an update on his mother's case. He had been doing this since 2003, when he found out the unit existed. He received form responses. He submitted them anyway, because the act of asking was the only form of not giving up that was available to him. Every case on this channel begins with weeks of digging, finding the files, finding the people, finding the thread that nobody followed the first time. If this work matters to you, please take a second to like and subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get back to Elena. In the spring of 2021, the New York City Police Department's Cold Case Unit assigned Detective Iris Mendez to a batch of pre-1985 homicide cases flagged for evidence reprocessing under a department initiative funded by a state forensic modernization grant. Elena Vega's case was on the list. Mendez was 38 years old, a 14-year veteran of the department who had spent the last 4 years in the Cold Case Unit. She read the original case file in one sitting. She noted the 2 fingerprints logged from the stairwell in 1979. She noted that neither had been matched. She requested that both be digitized and submitted to the state's automated fingerprint identification system, technology that did not exist in 1979 and that had been substantially upgraded in the years since the prints were last checked. The first print, the partial 3-segment lift from the interior railing, returned no match. The second print, the fuller lift from the door handle at the stairwell entrance, returned a match in 11 days. The match was to a man named Gerard Poole. His prints were in the system because he had been arrested in 1993 on an unrelated matter in New Jersey and processed at that time. The 1993 arrest had not resulted in a conviction. The prints had sat in the system for 28 years without ever being cross-referenced against the 1979 evidence from 1114 Morrow Avenue, because in 1979 the evidence had been logged on paper in a precinct file, and in 1993 the New Jersey arrest had been processed through a separate system. The 2 records had never spoken to each other. Gerard Poole was 86 years old. He was living in a retirement community in Monmouth County, New Jersey. He had left the Bronx in 1990, 11 years after Elena Vega's death. He had spent his later working years in warehouse security. He had never married. He had no children. His neighbors at the retirement community, when later interviewed, described him as solitary, self-sufficient, and unremarkable. He kept to himself. He ate in the dining room at the same time every day and sat at the same table. He had a small television in his room and a collection of paperback westerns arranged by author on a single shelf. He did not appear to have close friends. Detective Mendez drove to Monmouth County on a Wednesday morning in September 2021. She was accompanied by a New Jersey State Police detective. They met with the director of the retirement community first, then went to Poole's room. He answered the door in a cardigan and reading glasses. He looked at their badges. He looked at Mendez. "I've been waiting for this," he said. He said nothing else for 40 minutes, until his attorney arrived. He was arrested and transported to New York, where he was charged with murder in the second degree. His attorney argued against extradition on medical grounds. The arguments were denied. He was arraigned in Bronx County in October 2021. Carlos Vega was in his kitchen in Queens when Detective Mendez called him. He was making coffee. He had to sit down. He said afterward that his first thought was not of himself, but of his brother Miguel, who had died of cancer in 2015 without ever seeing this day. His second thought was of his father, who had died in 2011. His third thought was of his mother, 34 years old, in the utility stairwell of her own apartment building at 7 in the morning on her way home from a night shift at a hospital. Having done everything right. Having earned everything the day was supposed to bring her. The reaction in the Bronx, among the dwindling number of people who had any connection to the original events, was precisely the kind of shock the title of this case describes. The name Gerard Poole had not been a name anyone in the building had feared in 1979. He had been a non-presence, a closed door on the 6th floor, a man who collected his mail and said he hoped they found who did it. He had attended Elena's funeral. Thomas had invited the building, because that was what you did, and signed the condolence card and handed it to Thomas with both hands and looked him in the eye. He had then continued living in that building, on the 6th floor, for 11 more years. Mr. Bautista, the building's super, had died in 2004, but his daughter, who had grown up at 1114 Morrow Avenue, was contacted by a reporter after the arrest. She said her father had always been troubled by the Vega case, that he had never been comfortable with the fact that it was never solved, that he had told her more than once in his later years that he felt he had missed something. He would have been relieved, she said, and heartbroken, both at once. In March of 2023, Gerard Poole pleaded guilty to murder in the second degree. He was 87 years old. He was sentenced to 20 years to life. The judge noted from the bench that the sentence was not a formality, that the court did not treat a murder conviction as reduced in seriousness by the passage of time or the age of the defendant, and that Elena Rosa Vega had been 34 years old and had been returning home from a night shift to her husband and her children when she was killed in the stairwell of her own building by a man who had lived 4 floors above her. Poole was remanded to a state correctional medical facility. He made no statement. Carlos Vega addressed the court before sentencing. He was 60 years old. He stood at the podium and read from a prepared statement, slowly and without raising his voice. "My mother got on a bus at 6:52 in the morning," he said. "She had worked all night. She was going home. My brother and I were going to see her before school. That's what she arranged her whole life around, being there when we needed her to be there. She made it work. She made everything work." He paused. "I have been asking about her case for 45 years. I am glad I lived to see this. I am sorry my father did not. I am sorry my brother did not. I want people to know that she was not just a case number. She was Elena Rosa Vega. She grew tomatoes on a fire escape in the Bronx. She called her mother every Sunday. She knew more than she let on." He stopped. "I just wanted somebody official to say her name and say what happened to her, and say it was wrong." That took 45 years. It should not have taken 45 years. But it happened. And I'm grateful. The case has been incorporated into NYPD cold case protocols as an example of the forensic dividends available in pre-digital evidence storage. Specifically, the value of digitizing and resubmitting analog fingerprint lifts from pre-1985 cases against modern biometric databases. The two prints logged in 1979 had been sitting in an evidence storage box for 42 years. The second one was the answer. It had always been the answer. The technology to find it just hadn't existed yet. Elena Rosa Vega would have been 79 years old this year. She might have watched her grandchildren grow up in Queens. She might still have called her mother in Ponce every Sunday. Or, as the years took their toll, she might have been the one receiving the call from Carlos, the Sunday morning check-in that families build their routines around. Her tomatoes might have been famous by now, moved from the fire escape to a proper garden somewhere, passed down as seeds or just as the memory of how she grew them in a building in the Bronx in the 1970s, with the city falling apart around her and supper on the table anyway. She was 34 years old. She had worked all night. She had gotten on the bus at 6:52 in the morning, and she had done everything right. And it was not enough, and it should have been enough, and for 45 years there was no official answer for why it wasn't. Now there is. His name is Gerard Poole. He is in a correctional medical facility in New York State, and Elena Rosa Vega's name was spoken aloud in a courtroom in the Bronx, with the weight of a verdict behind it. 44 years after the man who killed her stood at her husband's side and said he hoped they found who did it. Before you go, 3 questions. The canvass of 1114 Morrow Avenue was never completed. 14 units never opened their doors. How much does the breakdown of trust between a community and its police department affect what gets solved and what doesn't? The fingerprint that identified Gerard Poole was sitting in an evidence storage box from 1979 until 2021, 42 years. How many other cases from this era have the answer already in storage, waiting for someone to run the comparison? And when Carlos Vega says he's grateful, after 45 years, after losing his father and his brother before the verdict came, what does gratitude look like in a situation like that? And what does it tell us about what families carry when the justice system leaves them waiting? Justice found Elena Rosa Vega 44 years after she came home from the night shift and never made it upstairs. She grew tomatoes on a fire escape in the Bronx and called her mother every Sunday and knew more than she let on. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. Subscribe so you don't miss the next case. Thank you for being here.